Welcome to Azur Lane Meta. We are here back again with another meta analysis video, and while this is not a total meta changing video, this does have some interesting perspectives to look at for number geeks like myself. Welcome back, guys. Today we're going to be going a little bit out of order from what I typically do. We're going to start with the meta pie chart breakdown, and this is going to be less important to look at than typical months. So usually for a month, I culminate both seasons into the pie chart and average them out. Well, because of the vast differences between the two seasons in the month of May, which has a valid reason for them to be significantly different, this means that the results of this pie chart are going to be muddled and it's not really meaningful to analyze. I'm just putting it here for consistency purposes of the thumbnails, really. So with the new order, we'll get into my favorite part, which is the time graph of the fleet compositions. And this is because this points out one very important thing I want to talk about that we get to observe in the month of May. So in my last video, I announced that at the very end of the season, we had a bug with Nagato, where her buff only buffed herself rather than the whole Japanese faction. At that point, it was not well known that it occurred, but after that video announcement, it was known, and it was fixed about 2 weeks later. Perfect thing about 2 weeks is that's one season. This means that we get to observe one pretty much full season where the bug occurred, and in this set of data, we get to observe one season afterward to see what happened when they fixed the bug. So we get to see if there's any difference. Well, considering the blue section, because anything before the blue section is only one server, not the culmination of all 4 servers, and because of the fact that the server we used for the white server was the baby server, it had less people who were older and had Nagato. So for the Nagato fleet, or for the Amagi fleet, we had less people. But if we're considering the blue, which is the valid seasons for comparison, can you tell which season Nagato was debuffed? And mind you, Nagato is a key component to the Amagi fleet. Yes, if you guessed the second to last week from the right, that is the dip right there. And that's fantastic. We see that dip. And when we look at the specific fleet compositions, we'll see that Nagato decreased in usage by almost 10%. And that's awesome. So people basically adjusted their meta fleets a little bit because of the bug. Nagato's still great when she buffs herself, and the IJN faction is still fantastic. But it is nice to see a response of what could happen if we debuff Nagato. Another thing you see here is that other category jump up. This is not like an error of any sort. This is a lot of people started testing, now that Nagato was not just destroying all the fleets, started testing other random stuff. There was a lot of real random stuff that was being used. There like no possible compositions, just throw some good ships together and put some good gear on them and just see how well they could do. And with no standing synergy from the IJN faction, they actually were usable and viable for this season. So that's like kind of interesting that we see that jump there. So let's take a look at the raw ship usage data. As I mentioned before, Nagato decreased by near 10% in the season that she had her bug in. We see that Amagi and Hiru, her common partners in crime, decreased by about 7% in those seasons as well. We see that Warspite did well. We also see that Yukikaze decreased by nearly 10% and then increased by 12% the season after, where Yukikaze is one of the best Vanguard ships there is, but she is pretty much tier 0 when she is buffed by Nagato. So kind of interesting to see that. Also, another thing you want to note is that King George V, which is a common counter because she buffs her attacks against the Axis ships, which include the IJN ships, the most relevant ships that she can in the meta, she decreased her usage as a percentage by half in that season, which I thought was Interesting. Another thing we want to consider between these last couple seasons here is that we got a rerun of Amagi. So notice that Amagi in this most recent season has overtaken Nagato as the most common ship, and that is simply because of an availability factor. Anyone who's started playing within the last year would not have access to the event exclusive Nagato, and not to Amagi either prior to this rerun event. So now that people have had access to this Amagi, we start to see that being used by newer players who want to play more. We also saw just more players playing PvP or trying to rush and trying to use viable defense fleets and things like that. I have a pretty good suspicion of why that has increased in the last couple months, but the point is more people are playing PvP. A lot of them are newer players, and so they don't have access to Namagi fleets, but now you gave them access to Amagi, so you saw her usage. An interesting note, when we get over to the pivot tables, we can see that a lot of the people that were using Nagato Akaga fleets were people that, had started playing because of the way that the events released. They potentially started playing after Amagi released and before Nagato released. So they were able to have access to Nagato, but not Amagi. Those people switched over to playing the Namagi fleets once the rerun happened, and they could now play the Namagi Ru, the Namagi Spite, Namagi DG, Namagi Prize, whatever Namagi variation they wanted to play. But we also saw that now a lot of players who are new got Amagi, and now they needed to find some non-event lock combinations that they could play. They don't have access to Warspite Retrofit if they're super new, and so a lot of them actually just picked up the Fox Mines. Good old trusty Fox Mines are available to new players, and they picked up Akaga fleet. So we see that Akaga fleet still saw some usage even afterward, but I think the types of players that were playing the Akaga fleets kind of altered. But yes, overall we see more Amagi usage simply because more accessibility to newer players. The last thing I want to mention before we move on, which you may have already noticed when we looked at the graph before, is the usage in minor faction fleets. We see that the Russian fleets like Sovietskaya Russia and Gangut start to see a little bit more usage now that people have had time to level them. But we also see a little bit more usage in the French ships because people have had time to finish their Gascons, and Jean Bart gets paired with her a lot. And I'm super excited for this next French event that I have a video out where Richelieu will basically make the French fleet very viable. So we start to see minor factions pick up. I only expect that to be even further coming in the future meta-analysis videos. So this is just a quick glance at the pivot table for the latter half of the month that I think is relevant to look at for things going forward, since that first half of the month was kind of a fluke because of the bug. So for the latter half of the month, let's take a look at what people are using with Namagi. It is almost evenly split, with Namagi Ru slightly edging out Namagi Spite. And there's such a good variety of things that you can put with Namagi here. So basically showing that you can put nearly anything with Namagi and call it relevant. And that's all I really want to show you from the pivot table this time. Everything else is fairly boring. Now we can look at the Vanguard pivot table. Here we see the most popular fleet is Juno Yukikaze no Shiru, which is overtaken. We start to see a lot of usage in Azuma as people start to get her dev level 25. And hate to break it to you guys, the first couple dev level 30 Azumas have hit the English servers, so we will have to deal with that going forward. So we start to see Azumas creep up. I'll expect to see that more. Juno Belfast Yukikaze is always a relevant ship composition, so it's still, I think, the second most common fleet here. It's very good for newer players. I mean, on my Amagi server that I stream with, that account, I use that Vanguard because it's the most accessible for newer players, so I don't imagine that to drop off. A couple of other things that are in the double digits here for usage that you can pause and take a look at. Last thing to look at from the 4 main servers is the heat map. Last time I took it out of the video and put it in a spreadsheet, and that video actually performed pretty much worst in the series of late. So we're going to put it back in the video and just pause the video where you want to scroll. The only thing that really stands out to me is that fleets that are using Azuma tend to use Frederick as well, which is kind of interesting. They don't have any synergies together. I think that's just the fact that those two ships are typically developed at a similar pace if you're talking from a blueprint perspective, and the whales that can finish one will ultimately probably finish the second one right around the same time. So I don't think there's any viable strategic reason why those are put together other than the fact that they can be completed at similar times. So we will finish off the video by looking at the Amagi server stats. They are still going to be separated because their meta is so different, being that they are such a new server. We see that Hood continues to decline in her usage from 93% in the first season to 75% to 55% to under 50%, 40-ish% in this most recent season. She actually lost her title of being the top ship. Amagi, with her rerun event, or I guess for this server, the first run, pops up to 60% and makes up the meta. We see Hiru, Saratoga are great meta ships here. Tosa, the Ikaga fleet is relevant here. Unicorn is just part of the fact that everyone got her and probably leveled her, and she's really good for PvE, so if you're kind of doing a mix of both, you want them. Portland remains on top. I don't expect that to last for much longer. This might be her last season on top. Yukikaze is quickly catching her as people can pull her from the light general construction build pool. We see a lot of the beginning ships still relevant because that's probably the first ship that you level, and those ships are all A tier for PvE. We see that Juno starts to see some relevance. People start to farm and level her, so that's great. Ainami, who's not really a starter ship, but a collection ship from the starters, is starting to be used as people have finished max limit breaking their starter ships, and she's actually pretty decent in this set. San Diego sees some popularity, and as people prepare for the announced rerun of the San Diego retrofit event, we see a lot of diversity here as people are playing the ships that they like, the ships that they can. There's no Nagato to basically just shut down the meta. Amagi's pretty much the closest thing here. Yukikaze is the closest thing here. We start to see some of those PR ships, but none of them are dev level 30 yet, so not too scary. Thank you guys for watching. I continue these meta-analysis series because I think a lot of you enjoy them. This is probably one of the most popular series on my channel. But the next video coming on my channel is going to be super awesome, not as number geeky as some of these videos. And so if you did watch this video, please subscribe because I don't think you're going to want to miss the next video that I have. Been working on it for a long time, and I'm super excited for it to drop.